Blood was pooling on the linoleum floor of trauma bay, faster than the high wall suction could clear it. The heart monitor shrieked a high-pitched, relentless warning of an impending flatline. Dr. Richard Hayes, the hospital's golden boy attending, froze, his hands slick with crimson, staring at the catastrophic arterial bleed he had just accidentally triggered. Panic seized the room. The junior residents stepped back. Then, a quiet, steady voice sliced through the chaos. "Move away from the table, doctor. You're killing him." The woman who stepped up wasn't the hotshot new surgeon the rumor mill had promised. She didn't even have an MD. She was a nurse, and in 30 seconds, she was going to do the impossible, setting off a chain of events that would end with a 4-star Marine general arriving in the lobby to demand respect for a legend. The rumors had been swirling around the break rooms of Harborview Medical Center for 3 weeks. The board of directors had allegedly secured a heavy hitter from the East Coast to overhaul the notoriously chaotic Level 1 trauma department. The whispers promised a brilliant, maverick doctor, someone who had rewritten the textbooks at Johns Hopkins or perhaps Mayo Clinic. The ER staff, exhausted and overworked, had built up this mythical savior in their minds. So when Monday morning rolled around, the tension at the central nursing station was palpable. Dr. Richard Hayes, the current chief attending, stood by the telemetry monitors, sipping a macchiato, looking unusually defensive. Hayes was a brilliant surgeon, but he was also deeply arrogant, prone to throwing scalpels in the OR when things didn't go his way. He liked his department running under his absolute, unquestioned authority. At exactly 0700 hours, the double doors of the ambulance bay slid open. The woman who walked in didn't look like a savior. She looked entirely unremarkable. She was in her early 40s, wearing standard-issue navy blue scrubs that had seen better days, her brown hair pulled back into a tight utilitarian bun. She carried no designer leather briefcase, just a battered metal clipboard and a heavily worn stethoscope draped around her neck. She walked up to the central desk, her eyes scanning the chaotic whiteboards, the flashing call lights, and the exhausted faces of the night shift. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and remarkably steady. "I'm looking for Dr. Hayes." Hayes barely glanced up from the tablet in his hand. "If you're from the transport team, I need 2 beds moved from the ICU down to radiology 10 minutes ago. Get on it." "I'm not transport," she replied, not missing a beat. She extended a hand. "I'm Olivia Jenkins, acute care nurse practitioner. The board hired me as the new clinical director of trauma operations." The silence that fell over the nurses' station was deafening. A young triage nurse, Greg, actually dropped a stack of patient files. Hayes slowly lowered his tablet, his eyes raking over her with undisguised contempt. "A nurse," Hayes said, the word dripping with condescension. "The board promised me a co-director, a physician, someone with a medical degree who could actually help me manage the surgical load, not an administrative, glorified bedpan changer." Olivia didn't flinch. Her hand remained extended for a moment longer before she calmly lowered it. "My credentials allow me to manage complex trauma, perform advanced resuscitative procedures, and streamline triage protocols. I was brought in because your mortality rate in the golden hour is sitting at 14% above the national average, Dr. Hayes. I'm here to fix that." Hayes scoffed, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "Listen to me, Nurse Jenkins. I don't care what alphabet soup you have after your name. Here, doctors practice medicine. Nurses follow orders. You stay out of my trauma bays, you balance the schedule, and you make sure the gauze is stocked. Do we understand each other?" "I understand your perspective, Doctor," Olivia said mildly, her face an unreadable mask. "But I answer to the Chief of Staff, not to you." The animosity was immediate. Within hours, the entire department had written Olivia off. The doctors ignored her, and even the nursing staff, intimidated by Hayes' wrath, kept their distance. They watched as she quietly observed the trauma bays, taking notes on her battered clipboard, silently tracking the inefficiencies. Her first real test came at 1400 hours. The trauma alarms blared, signaling an incoming code 3. "Fall victim, 50 feet off scaffolding," the paramedic shouted as he aggressively pushed the gurney into Bay 1. "BP is 80/50, heart rate 130, obvious femur fracture, massive abdominal bruising." Hayes rushed in, flanked by 2 residents. "All right, let's get a fast exam. Push 2 units of O negative and get him to CT. He's bleeding into his belly." Olivia stood in the corner, her eyes fixed on the patient's neck. The veins were severely distended, bulging against the skin. She glanced at the monitor. The oxygen saturation was plummeting. 92, 88, 84. The patient's chest was rising unevenly. "Dr. Hayes," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the noise, "look at his jugular veins. He's got tracheal deviation to the right. It's a tension pneumothorax. He's not just bleeding. His lung has collapsed and is crushing his heart. He won't make it to the CT scanner." Hayes didn't even look at her. He fell 50 feet. "He's got a shattered pelvis and femur. It's hemorrhagic shock. Stay out of my way, Jenkins. Push the blood. His blood pressure isn't responding to the fluids because his heart can't pump." Olivia stepped forward. "He needs a needle decompression right now, or he's going to arrest." "Security!" Hayes barked. "Get her out of my bay." Before anyone could move, the monitor screamed. The patient's heart rate spiked to 160, then suddenly plummeted. V-fib. He was coding. "Damn it! Start CPR!" Hayes yelled, finally looking panicked. As the resident jumped onto the stool to start chest compressions, Olivia moved. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She smoothly reached over the tray, grabbing a 14-gauge angiocatheter. Before Hayes could physically stop her, she drove the needle directly into the second intercostal space on the left side of the patient's chest. There was a loud, distinct hiss of escaping air. Instantly, the monitor's erratic screeching leveled out into a steady, rhythmic beep. The patient's blood pressure began to climb rapidly. The crisis was averted in less than 3 seconds. Hayes stared at the needle protruding from the patient's chest, then glared at Olivia, his face flushed red with fury. "You ever touch a patient of mine again," Hayes hissed, stepping so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath, "and I will have your nursing license permanently revoked. Get out." Olivia held his gaze for a long moment, her expression entirely neutral. "The patient is stabilized, Doctor. I'll leave you to your work." She turned and walked out, leaving a stunned room in her wake. The residents whispered, the nurses exchanged wide-eyed looks, but instead of earning their respect, Olivia's actions had only solidified her as a dangerous rogue in their eyes. In the medical hierarchy, you didn't publicly humiliate the king, even if the king was wrong. For the next 2 weeks, the ER was a hostile environment. Hayes made it his personal mission to freeze Olivia out. He rerouted shift schedules to ensure she was kept busy with administrative bureaucracy, far away from critical patients. He openly mocked her during morbidity and mortality rounds. "As you know," Hayes would drawl to a room full of medical students, "in emergency medicine, we rely on physician-led intuition, not the superficial textbook memorization of mid-level providers who think a few hours in a sim lab equates to medical school." Olivia endured the abuse with a stoicism that was almost unnerving. She didn't complain to HR. She didn't snap back. She just quietly did her job, reorganizing the triage flow, updating the mass transfusion protocols, and sitting alone in the cafeteria during her breaks. But her quiet demeanor masked an incredibly sharp, heavily trained mind. Whenever she passed a trauma bay, her eyes would sweep the room, instantly calculating blood loss, diagnosing injuries, and anticipating complications faster than the attending physicians. The breaking point arrived on a torrential Thursday night. The rain in Seattle was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, turning the I-5 interstate into a death trap. At 22:15 hours, the red phones at the nurses' station lit up simultaneously. "Multi-vehicle pileup on the I-5 bridge," the dispatch operator's voice cracked over the radio. We have an overturned semi-truck and at least 12 cars involved. Mass casualty incident declared. We are sending you 6 red tags, ETA 5 minutes. The ER exploded into action. Hayes began shouting orders, assigning doctors to bays. Olivia immediately stepped out of her office, grabbing trauma shears and gloves. "Jenkins," Hayes yelled across the room, "you handle the walking wounded in the waiting room. Keep them out of our way." Olivia ignored him, walking directly into Bay 1, the designated bay for the most critical patient. "I am an acute care nurse practitioner with critical trauma certification. In an MCI, all available providers step up. I am taking Bay 1. Before Hayes could physically drag her out, the paramedics burst through the doors. The scene was pure carnage. John Doe, mid-20s. The paramedic shouted over the screaming of other patients. Pinned between a steering wheel and a semi-truck grill for 20 minutes. Extrication was a nightmare. He's got a crushed pelvis, bilateral femur fractures, and a massive laceration to the right femoral artery. We've got 2 tourniquets on, but they're failing. He's bled out half his volume on the asphalt." They shifted the young man onto the trauma bed. He was ashen, his skin translucent. He was barely breathing. "BP is 60 over palpable," the resident shouted. "He's crashing." "Get the MTP started," Hayes barked. Rushing to the patient's leg, he tore off the field dressings, revealing a horrific wound that was pumping bright red arterial blood with every weak heartbeat. "Clamps! Give me clamps! I need to tie off this artery." Hayes dug into the wound, but the anatomy was completely destroyed. "There's nothing to clamp! It's shredded! Pack it! Give me combat gauze!" "Doctor, Hayes, his pelvis is completely unstable," Olivia said from the head of the bed, her hands quickly securing the patient's airway with an endotracheal tube in a fluid, practiced motion that took less than 5 seconds. "He's bleeding out internally from the pelvic ring fracture. The femoral bleed is secondary. If you don't occlude the aorta right now, he will die on this table." "I don't have time for a thoracotomy," Hayes screamed, his gloves completely soaked in blood. "He'll bleed out before I can crack his chest open." "You don't need to crack his chest," Olivia said, her voice dropping into a register of icy, absolute command that made the nurses freeze. "We need to drop a REBOA, a resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. REBOA is a highly complex, invasive procedure where a catheter with a small balloon is fed up through the femoral artery in the groin, straight up into the aorta, and inflated to physically block all blood flow to the lower half of the body. It stops massive pelvic bleeding and saves the brain and heart. But it is incredibly risky. 1 millimeter off, and you rupture the aorta, killing the patient instantly. It was a procedure usually strictly reserved for highly specialized vascular or trauma surgeons. "Are you insane?" Hayes yelled. "We don't even have a REBOA kit stocked in this ER, and even if we did, I haven't been certified on it yet. It's too new." "I have," Olivia said. She turned to a stunned scrub nurse. "Top drawer of my desk in my office. There is a locked black case. Bring it to me. Now, run." "Jenkins, no," Hayes roared. "I am not letting a nurse perform an experimental vascular occlusion on my patient. He's going to the OR. He's in pulseless electrical activity, doctor," Olivia said, pointing to the monitor, which showed an organized rhythm, but no actual pulse. "He's functionally dead. He will not survive the elevator ride." The nurse sprinted back into the room, tossing the black case onto the sterile tray. Olivia snapped it open, revealing a pristine, high-tech REBOA catheter system. "Security!" Hayes screamed, completely losing control. "Restrain her!" 2 hospital security guards, who had been helping direct traffic in the hallway, rushed to the doorway, but hesitated. The room was a bloodbath, and the intensity radiating from Olivia was terrifying. Olivia didn't look at Hayes or the guards. She grabbed an ultrasound probe in her left hand, slapped it against the patient's uninjured left groin, and located the artery. With her right hand, she took a large introducer needle. "Nurse Jenkins, stop!" Hayes lunged for her arm. Olivia didn't look up. Her left arm shot out, catching Hayes squarely in the chest with enough precise, leveraged force to send the chief attending stumbling backward into a rolling tray, sending instruments crashing to the floor. "Do not touch my arm while I am holding a needle," she said, her voice dangerously low. Without missing a beat, she plunged the needle into the artery. In less than 20 seconds, moving with a blinding speed and mechanical precision that defied belief, she threaded the guide wire, fed the catheter up the aorta, and checked the ultrasound screen. "Zone 1 placement confirmed," she muttered to herself. She grabbed a syringe and inflated the balloon. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the machines. 10 seconds passed. Suddenly the heart monitor beeped. Then again. Then a steady, strong rhythm emerged. "Blood pressure is climbing," the resident whispered, staring at the screen in absolute shock. 60 over 40, 80 over 50, 95 over 60. He's got a strong carotid pulse. The bleeding in the crushed leg slowed to a mere trickle. The balloon had successfully blocked the blood flow, saving the patient's life and buying them exactly 45 minutes to get him to surgery. Olivia stepped back, stripping off her bloody gloves. She looked at the surgical team. "You have 45 minutes before tissue necrosis begins in the lower extremities. Get him to the OR." Hayes, picking himself up off the floor, was trembling with a mix of adrenaline, humiliation, and unprecedented rage. "You're done," Hayes breathed, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You assaulted an attending physician. You performed a non-sanctioned, highly invasive surgical procedure outside your scope of practice. You are suspended immediately. Get your things. By tomorrow morning, I am having you brought up on criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license." Olivia looked at Hayes. The adrenaline of the trauma seemed to drain away, leaving her looking tired. She didn't argue. She nodded slowly. "The patient is alive, Dr. Hayes. Do whatever you have to do." She walked out of the trauma bay, leaving her bloody scrubs in the disposal bin, packed her battered metal clipboard into her bag, and walked out into the Seattle rain. What Dr. Hayes didn't know, what no one in that hospital knew, was that the black case on her desk wasn't standard medical equipment. It was military issue, and the precise, brutal efficiency she had just displayed wasn't learned in a simulation lab. It was forged in blood and sand. The stark, sterile lighting of the hospital's executive boardroom was a jarring contrast to the blood-soaked reality of Trauma Bay 4. It was 0800 hours on Friday morning. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline was shrouded in a dismal grey mist. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Olivia sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple grey sweater and slacks, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She didn't look like a woman facing the destruction of her professional life. She looked mildly bored. Arrayed against her were the heavyweights of Harborview Medical Center. Dr. William Sterling, the chief of staff, sat at the head of the table, rubbing his temples. To his right was Patricia Collins, the ruthless head of the hospital's legal department, and to his left sat Dr. Richard Hayes. Hayes was out of his scrubs, wearing a tailored navy suit, a smug, vindictive glint in his eyes. He occasionally adjusted his posture, subtly wincing and drawing attention to the faint bruise forming on his chest where Olivia had shoved him. "Let the record reflect," Patricia Collins began, her voice like cracking ice, "that we are convened to address multiple egregious violations of hospital policy, scope of practice parameters, and basic medical ethics by nurse practitioner Olivia Jenkins." "She assaulted me," Hayes interrupted, leaning forward. "Let's not bury the lead, Patricia. She put her hands on an attending physician during a critical code, physically struck me, and hijacked a patient. I secured an airway and initiated a life-saving vascular occlusion on a patient in pulseless electrical activity," Olivia corrected, her tone completely even. "The patient's pelvis was shattered. He was exsanguinating. If we had waited the 4 minutes it would have taken to transport him to the OR, his brain would have suffered irreversible anoxic injury, and his heart would have stopped entirely. He would be dead." That is not your call to make. Hayes slammed his hand on the table. You are a nurse. You do not have the surgical privileges to drop a Reboa catheter in my ER. Actually, Olivia said, pulling a thin manila folder from her battered clipboard and sliding it across the polished wood, I do. If you check my credentialing packet, which I submitted to HR 3 weeks ago, you will see I hold an advanced certification in resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, signed off by the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Sterling opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the document. This is an unusual certification for a civilian nurse practitioner, Olivia. Be that as it may, it is valid, she replied. It doesn't matter, Hayes sneered. She operated entirely outside the trauma matrix. She insubordinately refused a direct order to step away from the table. She assaulted a superior. If word of this gets out, the liability for this hospital is astronomical. The patient's family could sue us into oblivion for unauthorized surgical experimentation. Patricia Collins nodded gravely. Dr. Hayes is right. Regardless of the outcome, Nurse Jenkins, your actions present an unacceptable legal and financial risk to this institution. You bypassed the chain of command. You used unapproved, non-formulary equipment, that black case you brought in. It's a standardized combat trauma kit, Olivia said quietly. We are not in a combat zone, Miss Jenkins, Sterling said, his voice heavy with finality. We are in a civilian hospital governed by strict protocols. We cannot have rogue providers, no matter how skilled they believe themselves to be, turning our ER into the Wild West. Sterling closed the folder. Olivia, the board brought you here to organize our triage flow, not to perform cowboy vascular surgery. Effective immediately, your employment at Harborview Medical Center is terminated. Furthermore, legal will be drafting a formal complaint to the State Board of Nursing, recommending the permanent revocation of your license. Dr. Hayes has also informed us he intends to file a police report for battery. For a long moment, the room was dead silent. Hayes sat back, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He had won. He had crushed the interloper. Olivia slowly stood up. She didn't argue. She didn't beg for her job. She calmly picked up her clipboard. The patient from the multi-vehicle collision, Olivia asked, looking directly at Sterling. Did he survive the night? Sterling blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yes, the vascular team repaired the femoral tear, and orthopedics stabilized the pelvis. He's in the ICU. Miraculously, he's stable. Good, Olivia said. That's all that matters. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. By 0900 hours, a security guard was standing by her locker as she placed her stethoscope and an extra pair of scrubs into a cardboard box. The ER staff watched her leave in hushed, awkward silence. No one stepped forward to say goodbye. By 1400 hours the following Tuesday, the ER was rapidly descending back into its usual state of localized chaos. Without Olivia's ruthless efficiency managing the triage board, wait times had spiked back to 6 hours. The trauma bays were disorganized, and the nurses were stressed. Dr. Hayes, however, was in his element. He was holding court at the central nurses' station, dictating charts to a medical scribe and loudly recounting the save he had orchestrated over the weekend to a group of wide-eyed third-year medical students. The key to trauma medicine is decisiveness, Hayes lectured, swirling a pen in his hand. When that young man came in with the crushed pelvis, the room was panicking. But as the attending, you have to cut through the noise. You stabilize, you control the bleeding, and you get them to the OR. It's about definitive, physician-led action. He casually omitted the part where a nurse had physically shoved him aside and saved the patient's life while he was screaming for security. Suddenly, the heavy glass automatic doors of the ambulance bay didn't just slide open. They locked open. The low murmur of the ER died instantly. Striding through the doors was not a paramedic crew. It was a detail of 4 massive, stern-faced men in crisp, impeccably tailored Marine Corps dress blue uniforms. They moved with absolute, synchronized purpose, their polished shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. Behind them walked a man who seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He was in his late 50s, with iron-grey hair cropped close to his scalp, and a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered granite. He wore the olive-drab Service Alpha uniform of the United States Marine Corps. On his shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars. His chest was heavy with rows of ribbons, including the distinct blue, white, and red ribbon of the Navy Cross. It was General David Garrison, Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. The security guard at the front desk practically choked on his coffee, instinctively standing up as the military detail bypassed the metal detectors completely and marched straight into the heart of the ER. Hayes, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, puffed out his chest and stepped forward to intercept them. "Excuse me," Hayes said, using his best authoritative physician voice. "This is a restricted clinical area. You can't just march in here. If you need the VA hospital, it's 3 miles down the road." The 4 Marines stopped, their eyes locking onto Hayes with terrifying blankness. General Garrison stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He looked at Hayes the way a man looks at a particularly annoying insect. "Are you the chief attending of this facility?" Garrison's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that carried effortlessly across the silent ER. "I am Dr. Richard Hayes." "Yes," he replied, straightening his tie. "And I'm going to have to ask you to leave the immediate trauma area." "I am General Garrison," he replied, completely ignoring the command. 4 days ago, a young man was brought into this emergency room following a catastrophic collision on the interstate. John Doe. He has since been identified as Corporal Bradley Evans, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion." Hayes's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, yes. The pelvic crush injury. I was the attending surgeon on that case. It was a highly critical situation, General, but my team and I managed to stabilize him. He's up in the ICU making a remarkable recovery under my care." General Garrison slowly reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I read the surgical report from the ICU, Dr. Hayes. It says Corporal Evans arrived in the OR with a Zone 1 Reboa catheter perfectly deployed, completely arresting a massive internal hemorrhage. "Yes," Hayes said smoothly, though a bead of sweat formed on his hairline. "It was an extreme measure, but necessary for the save." Garrison's eyes narrowed, pinning Hayes in place. "You dropped a Reboa blind in an emergency bay without fluoroscopy in under 30 seconds? It was a team effort, General, but as the attending—" "Cut the bullshit, Doctor," Garrison snapped, the sudden volume making 2 nearby nurses jump. "I know for a fact you didn't drop that balloon." Hayes bristled. "Excuse me?" "I spoke with Dr. Todd Rasmussen at Walter Reed this morning," Garrison continued, naming the legendary military vascular surgeon who had pioneered the endovascular balloon techniques for the Department of Defense. "Dr. Rasmussen is the man who wrote the protocol for the Reboa. He told me there are exactly 12 people on the West Coast certified to perform that specific maneuver under those specific, chaotic field conditions. And your name, Dr. Hayes, isn't on that list." Hayes opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The medical students behind him were staring wide-eyed. "So I'm going to ask you one time," General Garrison said, stepping so close to Hayes that the surgeon had to look up. "Where is Commander Jenkins?" Hayes blinked, completely derailed. "Commander? Who? Wait, do you mean Nurse Jenkins? Olivia?" "I mean Commander Olivia Jenkins, United States Navy Nurse Corps," Garrison corrected, his voice dripping with dangerous authority. "Former Chief of Trauma Operations for the Joint Special Operations Command at Role 3 Hospital in Kandahar. The woman who spent 4 years flying in the back of blacked-out helicopters into active firefights to pull my bleeding Marines out of the dirt." The ER was so quiet you could hear the IV pumps ticking. "Nurse Jenkins," Hayes stammered, the blood draining from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. She's not here. I see, Garrison said. When does her shift begin? She doesn't work here anymore, Patricia Collins, the head of legal, said, having rushed down from the executive suites when security alerted her to the military presence. She stepped forward, looking terrified. I'm Patricia Collins, General. I represent the hospital. Miss Jenkins was terminated last Friday. Garrison slowly turned his head to look at the lawyer. Terminated. Yes, sir. She performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, bypassed the chain of command, and physically assaulted Dr. Hayes. We had no choice. It was a massive liability. General Garrison stared at them for a long, agonizing moment. Then he let out a short, dark laugh that held absolutely no humor. A liability, Garrison repeated softly. He turned back to Hayes. You fired the Angel of Helmand Province because she bruised your ego. She assaulted me, Hayes defended, his voice pitching higher. She struck me when I tried to stop her from practicing medicine without a license. If she struck you, Dr. Hayes, you'd be eating through a straw, Garrison said coldly. She saved one of my recon Marines using a protocol she literally helped write under enemy fire, and you fired her for it. Garrison turned to his aide-de-camp. Major, get the Chief of Staff of this hospital down here right now. Tell him if he isn't standing in front of me in 3 minutes, I am pulling the Department of Defense's massive medical research grants from this entire university system by close of business today. The Major nodded sharply. Yes, General. Garrison looked back at Hayes, his eyes like chipped flint. You doubted her because she wore a nurse's badge. You have no idea who you just threw out into the street, but you're about to find out. Dr. William Sterling, Chief of Staff for Harborview Medical Center, was a man who usually moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone whose time cost $1,000 an hour. Today, however, he practically sprinted out of the polished steel elevators and into the chaotic emergency department, his lab coat billowing behind him. He had received the panicked call from Patricia Collins only 2 minutes prior. A 4-star general is in the ER. He's threatening the university's DoD trauma grants. Those grants amounted to nearly $45 million annually. Losing them would bankrupt the trauma division by the end of the fiscal quarter. Sterling skidded to a halt near the Central Nurses Station. The sight that greeted him made his stomach drop. General David Garrison and his massive Marine detail had formed an impenetrable perimeter. In the center, Dr. Richard Hayes looked like a deflating balloon, pale and sweating profusely, while Patricia Collins clutched her tablet like a shield. General Garrison, Dr. Sterling gasped, catching his breath and extending a trembling hand. I am Dr. William Sterling, Chief of Staff. Please, let's move this to my office. We can sort out this misunderstanding over coffee. Garrison didn't take the hand. He merely shifted his steel-gray gaze from Hayes to Sterling. There is no misunderstanding, Doctor. Sterling, Garrison said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal, quiet intensity that instantly silenced the surrounding medical staff. And I don't drink coffee with administrators who terminate decorated war heroes to protect the fragile egos of mediocre surgeons. Sterling swallowed hard. General, please. Nurse Jenkins committed a severe breach of protocol. She assaulted an attending physician and performed an experimental surgical procedure. We had a legal obligation to— Experimental? Garrison interrupted, pulling a thick manila dossier from the hands of his aide-de-camp and tossing it onto the nurse's station counter. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. The word confidential was stamped across the front in red ink. Open it. Sterling hesitated, then reached out and flipped the cover open. Patricia Collins leaned in, her eyes scanning the heavily redacted pages. That, Garrison pointed a gloved finger at the file, is the unclassified summary of Commander Olivia Jenkins's service record. While your Dr. Hayes was busy attending pharmaceutical dinners in Seattle, Commander Jenkins was serving as the Chief of Trauma Operations for the Joint Special Operations Command at Role 3 Hospital in Kandahar. She spent 4 years flying in the back of blacked-out H-60 Pavehawk helicopters into active firefights. Sterling's eyes widened as he read the citations. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. As for that experimental procedure, Garrison continued, his voice echoing off the tile walls, she didn't just learn it, she helped write the goddamn book on it. She spent 3 years at Walter Reed Military Medical Center, alongside Dr. Joseph Dubose, the actual pioneer of endovascular trauma surgery for the Department of Defense. They co-authored the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Protocols for field deploying the Reboe catheter. She holds an advanced tactical surgical certification from the American College of Surgeons, specifically requested and funded by the Pentagon. Hayes, desperate to salvage his crumbling reputation, took a step forward. She is still a civilian nurse in this hospital, General. She bypassed the chain of command. If that balloon had ruptured the aorta, the patient would have died instantly, and it would have been on my license. General Garrison turned his massive frame toward Hayes, invading his personal space. But it didn't rupture, did it, Doctor? Because she knew exactly what she was doing, and the patient she saved, Corporal Bradley Evans, happens to be one of my Force Reconnaissance Marines, a man who survived 3 combat deployments, only to be T-boned by a drunk driver in a semi-truck. Garrison leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. I pulled Corporal Evans's surgical chart from your ICU an hour ago, Dr. Hayes. Do you want to know what I found? Hayes froze, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. The operative report, Garrison said, straightening up and projecting his voice so every nurse, resident, and medical student in the ER could hear, dictated and signed by Dr. Richard Hayes, claims that he initiated and successfully placed the Reboa catheter during the mass casualty incident. There is no mention of Commander Jenkins. None. A collective gasp rippled through the nurses' station. Falsifying a medical chart was a career-ending offense. Claiming a highly complex, life-saving surgical procedure performed by someone else was not just unethical. It was medical fraud. Dr. Sterling turned slowly to look at his golden boy attending. Richard, Sterling breathed, his voice laced with horror. Tell me you didn't falsify the operative report. I was the attending of record, Hayes stammered, frantically looking around as the staff began to back away from him in disgust. I am legally responsible for the bay. The save goes under my name. That's how teaching hospitals work. That is fraud, Patricia Collins said, her voice shaking as the sheer magnitude of the hospital's liability suddenly shifted from Olivia Jenkins to Richard Hayes. Richard, if you signed a chart claiming you performed a vascular procedure you aren't credentialed for, he stole her valor, Garrison said in disgust. He let her save my Marine, he fired her for bruising his ego, and then he stole the credit to bolster his own goddamn metrics. Garrison turned his back on Hayes, dismissing the surgeon entirely, and focused his wrath on Dr. Sterling. You have until exactly 1700 hours today, Garrison ordered, tapping the counter with a heavy, rhythmic finality. First, Dr. Hayes's medical license will be reported to the State Medical Board for fraudulent charting. Second, you will completely expunge Commander Jenkins' termination from your records. Third, you will publicly issue a formal apology to her. General, I assure you, we will immediately launch an internal review, Sterling started, desperate to placate the 4-star general. You won't launch a review, you will execute my demands. Garrison cut him off. If these terms are not met by 1700 hours, I will make one phone call to the Secretary of Defense. By tomorrow morning. Every single DoD research grant, every military residency program, and every VA affiliation attached to Harborview Medical Center will be permanently severed. Do I make myself perfectly clear, Dr. Sterling? Sterling swallowed heavily, nodding in defeat. Crystal clear, General. Garrison nodded once. Major, he barked at his aide. Where is she? Sir, the Major replied, checking his phone. Human Resources had no forwarding address, but we tracked the emergency contact number on her employment file. It led back to a Navy administrative desk at Bremerton. We have her current location. "Let's go," Garrison said. He didn't look back as he and his Marines marched out through the automatic doors, leaving a shattered hospital administration and a ruined, humiliated Dr. Hayes in their wake. The Seattle rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets as the convoy of black military SUVs navigated the narrow, pothole-riddled streets of Pioneer Square. Far from the gleaming glass towers of Harborview Medical Center, this district was home to the forgotten, the homeless, the addicted, and the veterans who had slipped through the cracks of the system. The SUVs pulled up to the curb outside a dilapidated brick building. The neon sign above the door sputtered and buzzed, reading, "Pioneer Square Free Clinic and Outreach." General Garrison stepped out into the rain, ignoring the umbrella his aide offered. He pushed through the heavy wooden door of the clinic. Inside, the contrast to Harborview was jarring. There were no polished floors, no state-of-the-art telemetry monitors, and no armies of administrative staff. The lighting was dim, the paint was peeling, and the waiting room was packed with shivering, exhausted men and women seeking shelter and basic medical care. Yet, despite the poverty of the facility, the clinical area in the back was running with military precision. Garrison spotted her immediately. Olivia Jenkins was kneeling on the scuffed linoleum floor, wearing her worn navy blue scrubs. She was meticulously cleaning and debriding a severe, ulcerated wound on the leg of an elderly, bearded man wearing a faded Vietnam veteran hat. She moved with the same quiet, devastating efficiency she had shown in Trauma Bay 4. "Looking much better today, Arthur," Olivia said warmly, applying a fresh, sterile dressing and securing it with expert precision. "The antibiotics are doing their job, but you have to keep it dry. Promise me you'll stay off the streets tonight?" "I'll try, Doc. Nurse," the old man rasped, offering a toothless smile. "You've got magic hands, I swear." Olivia smiled, helping the man to his feet. As she turned to dispose of the biohazard waste, she froze. Standing in the narrow hallway of the free clinic, completely dominating the cramped space, was the commandant of the Marine Corps and his detail. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. Then General Garrison, a man who answered only to the President of the United States, slowly raised his right hand and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. Olivia wiped her hands on a towel and, standing up straight, returned the salute with the razor-sharp form of a Navy commander. "At ease, Commander Jenkins," Garrison said softly, stepping forward. "General Garrison," Olivia replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. "I didn't expect to see you in Seattle. If you're looking for a physical, sir, our EKG machine is currently held together by duct tape." Garrison chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "I'm not here for a checkup, Olivia. I'm here because 4 days ago, you dropped a Reboe balloon in a shattered pelvis and saved the life of Corporal Bradley Evans. He's one of mine." Olivia's eyes softened. "John Doe. I was wondering how he was doing. They fired me before I could follow up on his post-op labs." "He's alive because of you," Garrison said, his tone turning serious. "And I just came from Harborview. I had a very illuminating conversation with Dr. Hayes and your Chief of Staff." Olivia sighed, leaning against the counter. "General, please tell me you didn't threaten to level the hospital. I handled it. They had their protocols and I broke them to save the patient. I knew the consequences when I picked up the needle. The consequence should have been a medal, not a termination," Garrison growled. "Hayes falsified the surgical chart, Olivia. He claimed the Reboa placement as his own to cover his incompetence." Olivia's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger finally breaking through her stoic facade. Stealing a procedure on a chart wasn't just an insult. It was a profound violation of medical integrity. "He did what?" Before Garrison could elaborate, the front door of the clinic violently slammed open. A man in a cheap, rumpled suit stormed into the waiting room, shaking the rain off his umbrella. He looked around with immense distaste, flashing a silver badge at the terrified receptionist. "State Medical Board Investigation Division, The man barked aggressively. "I am looking for Olivia Jenkins. I was told she was volunteering at this dump." Olivia stepped out from the clinical area, her expression hardening. "I am Olivia Jenkins." The investigator marched over, pulling a thick envelope from his soaked briefcase. He aggressively shoved it toward her chest. "Notice of emergency license suspension and summons. You are ordered to appear before the Washington State Nursing Care Quality Assurance Commission on Friday to answer for charges of practicing medicine without a license, battery of an attending physician, and gross negligence." The investigator smirked. "Dr. Hayes filed the complaint personally. Your career is over, lady." Olivia didn't even flinch. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, a massive, white-gloved hand intercepted the envelope mid-air, snatching it from the investigator's grasp with terrifying speed. The investigator blinked, looking up. He finally registered the 4 towering Marines blocking the hallway, and the 4-star general holding his paperwork. "Excuse me," the investigator stammered, his bravado evaporating. "That is official state legal correspondence." General Garrison looked at the envelope, then slowly tore it in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall onto the wet floor. "Hey, you can't do that!" the investigator yelled, taking a step back as the Marines subtly shifted their weight, their hands resting near their sidearms. "Son," Garrison said, his voice deadly quiet, "I am General David Garrison, Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and you are harassing a decorated Navy officer who is currently operating under the direct jurisdiction of the Department of Defense." The investigator went pale. She's a civilian nurse. She is a commander in the United States Navy Reserve, Garrison corrected, and as of this morning, she has been retroactively activated to active duty status to consult on a highly classified tactical medicine initiative for the Pentagon. Garrison pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket and tossed it to his aide. "Major, get the governor of Washington on the line, right now. Tell him the commandant is waiting. And tell him if this bogus investigation isn't quashed in the next 5 minutes, I am pulling the National Guard medical funding for his entire state." The investigator backed away, his hands raised defensively. "Look, I just delivered the papers. Dr. Hayes pushed this through as an emergency priority." "Dr. Hayes," Garrison said, stepping forward so the investigator had to crane his neck to look up, "is currently under federal investigation for medical fraud and falsifying legal documents. You can tell your board that when you scurry back to your office. Now get out of my sight before I have my Marines physically remove you." The investigator didn't say another word. He turned and practically ran out the door, disappearing into the Seattle rain. Garrison turned back to Olivia, the fierce scowl melting away into a look of profound respect. "You don't need to fight these battles alone, Olivia," Garrison said quietly. "You spent 4 years pulling my boys out of the fire. It's my turn to return the favor." Olivia looked down at the shredded pieces of the subpoena on the floor, a profound sense of relief finally washing over her. She looked up at the general. "Thank you, General. But I meant what I said. I'm not going back to Harborview. They don't want me there. And honestly, I don't want to work in an environment that prioritizes ego over survival." "I know," Garrison said, a faint, knowing smile appearing on his weathered face. "That's why I didn't just come here to save your license. I came here to offer you a job." The rain outside the Pioneer Square Free Clinic beat against the frosted glass windows, but inside, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The oppressive weight of the medical board's threat had vanished, replaced by the imposing, undeniable presence of the United States military. General Garrison motioned for his detail to step back, granting Olivia a measure of privacy in the cramped hallway. He crossed his arms, the ribbons on his chest catching the flickering fluorescent light. "The Department of Defense has been watching the mortality rates in civilian Level 1 trauma centers across the country," Garrison began, his voice dropping into a professional command register. We are seeing civilian doctors fail at mass casualty incidents because they lack the tactical, austere environment training we developed in the sandbox. The Pentagon just greenlit a $50 million initiative to bridge that gap. We are standing up the Advanced Resuscitative Care Training Command at Madigan Army Medical Center, just south of here in Tacoma. Olivia listened intently, her clinical mind already grasping the scope of what he was saying. "We need a director," Garrison said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Someone who understands both the rigid bureaucracy of civilian medicine and the absolute, unforgiving reality of combat trauma. I don't want a suit. I don't want a politician. I want the practitioner who co-authored the TCCCC protocols with Dr. Dubose and isn't afraid to shove an arrogant attending out of the way to save a life." Olivia blinked, genuinely surprised. "You want a nurse practitioner to direct a Joint Forces Surgical Training Command? General, the civilian surgical boards will have a collective stroke. Attendings will refuse to take the course." "Let them try," Garrison rumbled, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "By the time we are done, completion of your course will be a mandatory prerequisite for any hospital wanting a dime of federal funding. They will learn from you, Commander Jenkins, or they will lose their trauma designations." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed envelope bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. He handed it to her. "Your orders, Commander, effective immediately. You'll have the budget, the staff, and the absolute authority to train the next generation of trauma providers. No more asking for permission to save a life." Olivia looked down at the envelope. It was everything she had ever wanted, a chance to enact real, systemic change without fighting the toxic, ego-driven hierarchy of civilian hospitals. "I'll take it," Olivia said quietly, her voice steady. "On one condition." Garrison raised an eyebrow. "Name it." Olivia looked back toward the clinical area, where Arthur and a dozen other vulnerable patients were waiting. "I get to keep my Tuesday and Thursday evenings open. The people in this neighborhood still need someone to change their dressings and listen to them." The general's expression softened into a look of profound, unwavering respect. "Done. I'll even have Madigan surplus medical supplies routed here weekly." "Welcome back to the fight, Commander. Underscore, 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 underscore." While Olivia was opening her orders in a dilapidated free clinic, a very different scene was unfolding in the pristine executive suites of Harborview Medical Center. Dr. Richard Hayes was frantically throwing files and textbooks into a cardboard box. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the tape dispenser. Across the room, Dr. William Sterling stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold disgust, flanked by Patricia Collins and two armed federal agents from the Office of the Inspector General. "You are overreacting, William," Hayes shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I am the top billing surgeon in this hospital. You cannot let them do this." "It's out of my hands, Richard," Sterling said flatly. "You didn't just lie on a chart to boost your ego. The patient, Corporal Evans, is active duty military. His care was billed to TRICARE. That makes your falsified operative report a matter of federal healthcare fraud." "I was the attending," Hayes pleaded, turning to the federal agents. "I oversaw the room. It's a technicality. The National Practitioner Databank has already been notified," Patricia Collins interjected, her lawyer's veneer completely stripped of any sympathy. "Your state medical license has been suspended indefinitely, pending a full criminal investigation. Harborview is severing all ties with you to protect our remaining grants. You are a liability, Dr. Hayes." One of the federal agents stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Dr. Richard Hayes, you are under arrest for violating 18 U.S.C., Section 1347, healthcare fraud, and falsifying federal medical records. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." As the cold steel clicked around Hayes's wrists, The reality of his arrogance finally shattered him. He was paraded out of his office, down the main elevator, and straight through the center of the emergency department. The nurses, residents, and staff he had belittled for years stopped and watched in stunning silence as the untouchable golden boy of Harborview was escorted out the sliding glass doors, never to return. 6 months later, the atmosphere in Trauma Bay 4 was completely different. The new chief of trauma, a humble, highly competent surgeon who had recently transferred from a military VA hospital, was leading a code. The room was calm, communicative, and efficient. Up on the whiteboard, tucked into the top right corner where the charge nurses kept the important contact numbers, there was a new addition. It read, Madigan Advanced Trauma Command, Duress Jenkins, NP. She was no longer just the quiet woman with the battered clipboard. In the halls of Harborview, and soon in trauma centers across the country, she was known simply as the Standard. They had doubted the new trauma doctor, right up until the moment they realized she didn't need the title to be a legend. The story of Commander Olivia Jenkins serves as a stark reminder that true expertise is forged in the crucible of experience, not merely printed on a degree. In high-stakes environments like trauma medicine, rigid hierarchies and unchecked egos can become just as lethal as the injuries themselves. Olivia's quiet professionalism, juxtaposed with Dr. Hayes' fatal arrogance, highlights that leadership and life-saving capability often come from the most unassuming individuals. Ultimately, respect is earned through decisive, competent action, and reality will always expose those who rely on titles rather than talent.